threefold. Space is lacking for all that needs packing, much less enough room to recoil from tempers when they start to boil. Weathered in, laid up, broken down, an unexpected run to town, the captain's ruthless organization results from anything provoking frustration. Weak brew, lazy crew, mounting debt, quotas unmet. Interruptions in fishing primarily set the time bomb ticking. Once it blows, anything out of sync could find itself in the drink. Busted, rusted, and now untrusted. Torqued out tools, ratty rain gear, burned breakfast, unlustrous lures, decaf coffee. Electronics that no longer beep are routinely booted to the briny deep. Faulty fathometer? Huh, fathom this, as it's committed to the abyss. A hefty garbage sack, doubling as a clothes pack, turns out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Anything that ceases being reliable could find its passage no longer justifiable. A function unfulfilled, purpose unperformed, mission unmet, going overboard is an even bet. When patience is fried, free rides the captain can't abide. And so, off they go. She don't work, she don't ride. The hefty garbage sack, by the way, actually happened. My mom and brother lived on the boat with Dad for a couple years when he was a baby, and his clothes were kept in a black garbage bag, as was most everything on the boat. Until one day when the clothes bag was stored somewhere that Dad ended up wanting to be in a hurry, and that was the end of my brother's baby clothes. This other poem comes from my dad's habit of getting up at 3 a.m. for an opener to be on the water at 4. I always admired that kind of work ethic, doing something because it needs to be done, not just because someone's telling you to do it. And as much as I realize that fishing isn't as romantic as I sometimes imagine it to be, I know that I don't have what it takes to lead that kind of life. I still kind of wish that I did. So this one's called 3 a.m. At 3 a.m., I long for fishermen, to rise like the tide, and those who chart their lives by it. Splice the fray between work and day, define destiny by necessity. Effort directed what and when, by a higher power than the to-do pen. Hitch fortune to the universe and what you can make when you're fully immersed. Banking on slick silver, fresh and whole. Work that feeds families and sustains souls. Scheduled by seasons, governed by nature's reason. At 7 a.m., I rise as the clock tells me when. In piety to the anxiety of society. Dress for fashion, not function. Scheduled by calendar, governed by order. No time for living, despite my misgiving, when heeding the call of the conference. I bait my email subject lines, soak in what's assigned, cast data into the void, these skills of today's employed. Pick memos, hook meetings, land contracts, ice contacts, or pay the price in performance reviews, since there's no fish in a net to gauge what's met from this endless turning of the screw. But there is utility in this seemed futility, and myopia in the utopia of being as free as the deep wide sea. The ideal is mythological, illogical, as cake without calories, trust without risk, love without compromise, a leg up without a skinny. Regulations, mitigations, limitations, political machinations, they're caught in their own aggravations. We each have our lines to resign. And no amount of will, or the best seasickness pill, could make their boots mine to fill. Still, I could stand more salt in my days, and to plow into the waves. Lose my lines, heave my hull, shove off from shore, and the next day come back for more. When I unplug for bed, I can't quite drown the part of my head that yearns for the tide to turn. But instead of to sea, I should face what's in me, in the style of those who live by their wiles. to seek the line between fine and divine, thicken my skin and live until I give out, not give in. At 3 a.m., I still long for fishermen. All right, take 2. We can do this. Dad never liked to make anything terribly easy, so. Thanks, Pop. Being independent and self-directed are a few of the things I got from Dad. And there was a lot to be learned from him. That bacon should be cooked in the oven. That cottage cheese is actually not as gross as it looks. That any music is worth listening to if it's performed live. That pie is perfectly acceptable for breakfast. And that a deck of cards is not ready to be dealt until it is shuffled exactly twice, followed by 3 taps on the table. He didn't teach the way Uncle Martin or Aunt Alta or my mom would in a classroom directly through explanation. Dad taught by example, and it was up to you to be smart enough to pay attention. He taught me everything I know about using tools, carpentry, plumbing, electrical, and picking out materials. Flathead, I said Phillips. Well, I don't know who these Phillip people are, and why did they give out the screws? Dad being Dad, some of these lessons were how not to do things. Measure twice, cut once was not something I learned from my dad. Inventive, colorful vocabulary, though, was a recurring refresher. But even the mistakes were valuable. Sure, it's good to know how to do something right the first time, when all the stars and angles align, but inevitably something's going to get fouled up, and it's important to also know how to fix it when that does happen. Dad never met a project he wasn't willing to tackle, and they all started with the same magic words. You know, what a guy could do is... From remodeling the bathroom to building rocking chairs, replacing the roof, refinishing and rewiring his entire cabin after a fire on the boat, perfecting a system for making peanut butter balls, or designing a false bottom in his boat hold as a way to haul up his catch so his increasing lack of mobility wouldn't stop him from going fishing. Big or small, simple or complex, whether he had any previous experience or read the manual or not, it was never a question of being able to figure it out, because he always did. It might not always happen the way he planned, or it might not turn out as he originally intended, but he demonstrated time and again that the most important step in accomplishing any goal is having the confidence to try, and try again, and scrap the cockeyed parts, toss the first attempt, scrape off the burn sections, and keep on trying until you get it done. Even on his crutches, with failing eyesight and hands cramped and swollen, he was still always on the lookout for a project. He decided that the perpetually rotting fence in the front yard needed to be replaced a few years ago. So there was Dad, this octogenarian, white-haired and stoved up, always short of breath with his health conditions, hunched over on the ground by the side of the road, crutches lying next to him in the grass, to get a better angle with the screw gun, just working away. Except he kept getting interrupted by people walking by who were trying to help him up. And drivers slamming on their brakes to hop out and see if he needed assistance. They better mind their own business if they're going to need help up. And that's another part of the lesson. Don't listen to those who assume you can't do something when you know you can, even if you look to all the world like you've fallen and can't get up. He also taught that you remain calm in a crisis, no matter the volume of excrement hitting the ventilation system. But that it's completely acceptable to freak out over a stubbed toe or whacked funny bone. My Uncle Arlen and Brother Jeff were fishing with him one time when the boat got overloaded, a good problem to have, and they started taking on water and the pump quit working. It was clear they were going down, so Dad did what was necessary. He floated the skiff out behind the boat and loaded it with what he considered to be all the valuables worth saving. My brother, Dad's rifle, and his little TV set. And that was it. It was up to Arlen to radio the natives. My brother remembers a time when he and Dad were coho fishing, and Dad apparently wanted a few kings to smoke up when they got home. Except kings weren't quite open for retention yet. Unbeknownst to Jeff, Dad landed 3 decent-sized kings, gutted and iced them, and put them in the bottom of the hold with the cohos on top. When they went to sell their catch, my brother was pitching fish out of the hold, and at the bottom of the pile lugged out a much bigger fish than the rest, not realizing there were kings down there. Dad appeared and very calmly informed the buyer that, oh, that dang kid, he's new to this. Doesn't know the difference between a king and a coho. What are you doing with those in there? We'll just take care of those, he said, putting the king back in the hold. They left and headed for the harbor. As they were pulling in, they noticed a fish and game officer standing on the dock, right where they were going to tie up, as if he'd been waiting for them. Now, Dad could land a boat on a piece of driftwood in a tsunami, yet the throttle accidentally got away from him, and Dad somehow managed to graze the boat ahead of where they were going to land, getting tangled in their lines. Jeff was sent to untangle, on the side facing the fish and game officer. While working, Jeff heard a series of sounds. Kersploosh! Which was an awful lot like the sound of a king salmon hitting the water. Then another, kersploosh! Then a kerthunk! Jeff looked, and there was Dad, who had slipped on the deck and was now lying flat on his back with the last king salmon on top of him. Jeff glanced back at the officer, who was now walking up to the boat and was about at the point where he'd be able to see Dad. Kersploosh! Just as the officer came into view. Hello, he greeted them. Well, hello there, Dad responds, cool and calm as ever. We had a report of someone poaching deer on the beach you guys just came by, and I was just wondering if you saw anything. No? Okay, well, thanks anyways. You guys have a good day. As the officer walked away, Jeff heard a couple other sounds. And yet, you dump the queen on my dad in hearts, and you'd think it was the apocalypse. You rat! What'd you do that for? Where'd you learn to play like that? Me? Aw, bullshit. I'd never do such a dirty trick. Until the next hand, of course, when he'd delight in pulling exactly that same trick. Dad was also the consummate example of being tough. When he'd go out fishing, we would expect to not see or hear from him until the opener had closed, weeks or longer at a time. But occasionally, my brother and I would come home to find him in early, sitting in his chair, with a little too straight a posture. It inevitably meant he cracked some ribs, or dislocated a shoulder, or tore a rotator cuff, or crunched an ankle, or otherwise busted himself up. And there he'd sit, just waiting out the healing process, until he'd knitted together enough to head back out on the water. The legendary example is in 1986, when he was fishing without a deckhand, pulling in kings, when one of them shook the hook and sent it flying at his face, sinking itself square in his right eye. The natural reaction, of course, when something is in your eye, is to get it the hell out. So he pulled the plug free, taking his cornea with it. He covered the mess with the cleanest of his fishy rags, and then started the hours-long run to Craig, where he ended up on a medevac to Seattle. He was 55, and it was the first time he'd been in a hospital since he was 16. when he broke both collarbones as he got pinned between some pilings in the boat he was tying up. The doctor saved his eye, but not the lens, and from then on, he could only ever see erratic blobs of light and dark in that eye. Which is fitting, since that's kind of what the eye looked like from the outside, sort of an erratic blob of light and dark. It made for a good prank, though, that he always enjoyed, anytime he had an eye test, to not warn the examiner beforehand. But the best part of the toughness lesson is that you don't have to be tough all the time. Anyone who met Dad knows that his voice was as gravelly as the bumpy road leading down Episcopal Hill, as it was called before it got paved. It was so low and gruff that when I was a kid, if my friends called and he answered, they would sometimes get so scared they'd hang up. But the gruff bit was mostly for show. It didn't take much to turn him into silly putty. Kids could do it in an instant. Little girls being particularly able to bend his otherwise iron spine around their little fingers. Just last week, he enthusiastically played Aunt Alta's visiting granddaughters in games of Old Maid and Rummy, letting them very seriously explain the rules as though he'd never played a card game before in his life. When he'd take his daughters, Jeanne and Julie, on the boat, they would of course get bored and decide to amuse themselves by playing beautician at Dad's expense, braiding and fluffing up his hair, painting his nails, and just making him all pretty. And when I was little, Dad would accordion himself into a tiny chair at my tiny play table, which he built, to have a tea party for me. Delicately clinking glasses and nibbling tiny sandwiches and raising his saltwater corroded pinky with every pursed-lipped sip. His other soft spot was a fluffy one. If he was talking to one of our cats, his movie villain-sounding voice would break into a sing-song and raise about 8 octaves. What are you doing, meow meow, huh? What are you doing? He'd stand in the doorway and coax in the string of cats we had over the years by the undignified names we'd given them. Rambo, here, Nermal, come on, scruffy cat, Fuzzy Butt, come here, Fuzzy Butt, Milkshake, Maw Cat, meow, 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 Maw Cat, come here, Lily Pad, Sweet Pea, here, Sweet Pea. At times, I wondered if the neighbors thought he was some kind of deranged Santa Claus, doing roll call for his 4th-string reindeer. But as long as his kitties were inside, safe and sound at night, most often snuggled up in his lap, regardless of whose cat they were supposed to be, he didn't care who heard or saw him, or how that might shine up his otherwise rusty appearance. And he taught that life is too short not to enjoy it. He had many hobbies that he greatly enjoyed throughout his life. Music, art, woodworking, tinkering of any kind, playing cards, cooking and baking. He liked what he liked, and he made no apologies for it, whether it made sense to anyone else or not. I woke up the morning of the 4th to discover he had been up early and baked a pumpkin pie. Pumpkin pie? On the 4th? Why? I asked. Well, it's good, isn't it? Well, yes, I had to agree. Then why the hell not? He was never quite satisfied with his pies. The crust was too tough, the filling too thick or too thin. It cooked too long or not long enough. But this pie, he unabashedly declared to be the best pumpkin pie he'd made in his life. And I'm glad he finally, after 70+ years of trying, hit his mark. I'm also kind of glad he only got through half of it and that Mom doesn't like pumpkin pie, because that meant I got to have the rest. And I wholeheartedly agree, that was the best pumpkin pie he ever made. With Dad, I learned that time is the most important currency in life. It offers the best return on investment when spent on what and who you value. Yet it's so easy to waste on unimportant things. Its value is deceiving because it comes in such small increments, and it seems like there's always more in reserve. But once it's spent, it's gone. And lucky are those who realize it and spend their time accordingly. In the last 10 years or so, I was lucky to have started to figure this out, though I wish I'd learned it sooner and lived it better. But the time I did spend with Dad is the best investment I could have made, because I can bank on those memories the rest of my life. Whenever I need a laugh, a story to one-up any crowd, the ability to try and fix something, the inventive profanity to use when it doesn't come out right, the motivation to tough something out, the example of being independent, self-reliant, and wholly unique, the permission to have a piece of pie and do what makes me happy, and the reminder of what it's like to be loved by someone who never did a damn thing because he was supposed to, but only if he wanted to. This part, the sharpness of losing him, the newness of missing him, is the